2006, an unexpected war erupts between Israel and Hezbollah. 15,000 Americans are trapped in Lebanon. U.S. Marines come to the rescue, but they need a nearby neutral destination to deposit the frightened American refugees. The island Republic of Cyprus, just 60 miles off the Lebanese coast, is the obvious answer. The Republic of Cyprus opens its arms to its American friends.
And the Cypriot government very quickly arranged accommodations for 15,000 people in 1 week. They put them up until they could get on their way back to the United States or to other parts of the world. So we were enormously grateful to the Cypriot government for what they did in a real crisis, in an hour of need, our need. They came through. They showed that they were good friends, and we won't forget that.
But past U.S. policy towards Cyprus demonstrates otherwise. In a recently declassified 1974 State Department memorandum, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger stated, "There is no American reason why the Turks should not have 1/3 of Cyprus." Summer 1974. Turkish forces invade with U.S.-supplied arms and occupy 1/3 of Cyprus.
4 minutes past 6, and the first of the Turkish troops have landed in Cyprus. About 5 of these aircraft passed over in the last 5 minutes. They were guided in by jet fighters, and the very first paratroopers are now hitting Cyprus soil. İleriye!
According to the findings and judgment of the European Court of Human Rights of the Council of Europe, a substantial number of Greek Cypriot civilians were killed. Archbishop Makarios, president of Cyprus in 1974, listed the dead.
Ο αριθμός των θυμάτων ανέρχεται σε 6.500 περίπου. 3.500 είναι οι φωνευθέντες και 3.000 είναι οι αγνοούμενοι. Και από τους αγνοουμένους είναι ζήτημα αν επιζούν ολίγοι.
170,000 are forced from their homes and businesses.
Το σπίτι μας είναι στην Κερίνια, μένουμε στην Κερίνια. Όταν έγινε η εισβολή, μείναμε στο σπίτι μας 4 μέρες, αλλά αναγκαστήκαμε να πάμε στο ξενοδοχείο Ντόουμ, όπου βρήκαμε άλλα 800 πρόσωπα. Εκεί έμειναμε εγκλωβισμένοι, κλειστοί όλη μέρα και δεν μπορούσαμε να βγούμε έξω.
Turkish troops take over the northern third of the island and continue to occupy that region to this day. Many observers believe the United States had the knowledge and power to prevent the Turkish invasion and later to compel Turkey to withdraw its troops. But the U.S. did neither of those things.
It was a clear violation of the rule of law. It was an aggression. It was a trampling on human rights. It was wiping out, democratic values.
The United States should have exerted more pressure on Europe, the members of the European Union, to act, to put pressure on Turkey.
Why did the United States fail to act? The answer lies in a tangled web of U.S. domestic politics, the realpolitik of Henry Kissinger, and the repeated refusal of successive U.S. presidents to demand that the rule of law and fundamental human rights be upheld in Cyprus. While U.S. politicians evaded the issue, Cyprus suffered.
Δεν ξέρω που είναι. Είναι αγνοούμενος. Γεια μου, παιδιά μου, αγωνίστε να γίνετε να περάω το γεια μου, παιδιά μου. Άιστε με να πάω. Ma io non capisco, io mi butto e mi
Πιάσαμε ανάκριση και μετά την ανάκριση πήραμε και κοιμήθηκα. Ήταν και ξυπνήσαμε η ώρα 10.30. Και ανταγώσαμε μου ξύλο και μας χειρώσαμε στο πλευρό τα χαμέ.
Μήπως είδατε το γιο μου?
Μα δεν έχουμε καθόλου πληροφορίες γιατί είναι αγνώμενο.
Αυτό είναι περισσότερο από ό,τι
Modern Cyprus remains a divided island. Its capital, Nicosia, a divided city.
We landed at the airport in Nicosia. It was around 10 o'clock in the evening, at night. My father-in-law came and picked us up from the airport, and we drove through the Greek Cypriot part of Nicosia. It was a beautiful city, lights everywhere, people going around, bars, open cafes, and I thought, God, it's beautiful. And then we came to the checkpoint where the two sides were separated. And when we crossed over to the Turkish Cypriot side, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was dark. It was like suddenly, in a matter of seconds, from a lighting area, you just moved into a dark area. No cars, no people, nothing moving. I mean, it was like a place, a derelict place.
The economy of the Turkish-controlled north has stagnated, while the economy of the Republic of Cyprus has thrived. Tourists from around the world flock to the lush beaches of Limassol, to the urbane shops and cafes of Nicosia, to the wondrous ruins of the ancient city of Kourion.
There is a magic in the air in Cyprus. There's some pull to the Cypriot earth. There's a presence of a huge storehouse of the common treasury of civilization involved there.
The mythical birthplace of Aphrodite and Adonis, Cyprus was first settled by mainland Greeks in 1600 BC, thus establishing the island's predominantly Greek character, which has been maintained to this day. The Turkish Cypriot minority descends from the Ottomans, who invaded Cyprus in the late 16th century. As 19th century nationalism cascaded over the decaying Ottoman Empire, the Greeks of Cyprus expected to be united with Greece, which had become a modern state in 1830. Instead, the Ottoman Emperor handed Cyprus over to Great Britain.
With the Turkish Cypriots, we have lived for over 400 years. And, only a very small fraction of that period, from 1571 until today, was a period of, let's say, friction.
After the Second World War, a movement to unite with Greece, known as Enosis, swept over Cyprus. By the 1950s, this movement erupted into armed conflict between Greek Cypriots and British colonial forces. Seeking help in the struggle, the British created allies within the Turkish Cypriot minority by exploiting their concern about Enosis. Centuries of peaceful coexistence collapsed as Turkish Cypriots battled against Greek Cypriots. The Turks now demanded partition of the island to protect their rights. The shooting ended in 1959 with the signing of the London-Zurich Agreement, which granted Cyprus a form of independence from Great Britain in 1960. The basic terms of the Constitution excluded partition and enosis. Archbishop Makarios, who led the Greek Cypriots through the 1950s, was elected the first president. The Turkish Cypriot leader, Dr. Fazil Küçük, was elected the vice president. The Turkish Cypriot minority was given considerable veto and administrative power. Great Britain, Greece, and Turkey guaranteed this independence and governing structure. Although fighting had ceased, animosities continued to simmer.
Η ένωση της Κύπρου με την Ελλάδα ήταν ανέκαθεν ο εθνικός πόθος των Ελλήνων Κυπρίων. Ένας πόθος βαθιά ριζωμένος μέσα τους. Και εγώ πολλές φορές μίλησα για την ένωση ύστερα από τις συμφωνίες Ζερίχης, διερμηνεύοντας ακριβώς αυτό τον πόθο. Ετώνιζα όμως πάντοτε πως το ευκταίον δεν είναι πάντοτε εφικτόν και ότι η ένωση δεν πραγματοποιείται εφόσον αντιτίθεται προς τούτο η Τουρκία.
By 1963, the Constitution had rendered the Cypriot government ineffective. The Turkish minority used its power of veto to stall legislation. President Makarios proposed amendments to eliminate the Turkish veto.
Θα έλεγα ότι οι ρίζες της διχόνοιας μεταξύ Ελλήνων και Τούρκων της Κύπρου ήσαν μέσα στο σύνταγμα μας, το οποίο περιείχε πολλά διαιρετικά στοιχεία.
The Turkish Cypriots then withdrew from the government, and once again, intercommunal violence erupted. Turkey threatened to invade Cyprus.
Και πολύ περισσότερο οφείλεται βέβαια στο γεγονός ότι η Τουρκία είχε εξ αρχής κατακτητικά σχέδια και βλέψεις και απέτρεπε τους Τουρκοκυπρίους από την συνεργασία με τους Έλληνας μέσα στα πλαίσια του συντάγματος.
The invasion was averted by President Lyndon B. Johnson.
Tension in the eastern Mediterranean and the threat of war between Greece and Turkey brought the evacuation of American, British, and UN dependents from the disputed island of Cyprus. NATO Secretary General Senior Brozio and President Johnson's special envoy Cyrus Vance also talked with Greek and Turkey's leaders.
Turkey was warned that there could be consequences of using U.S.-supplied military equipment against Cyprus. (1967) Greece. A right-wing military junta, led by Greek army colonels, overthrows the democratically elected Greek government. This junta reignites the fervor for enosis. For the next 7 years, President Makarios walks a thin line to maintain Cyprus as an independent republic. But in 1974, using extreme Greek Cypriot nationalists, the Greek junta overthrew Archbishop Makarios and attempted to assassinate him. He survived the attempt.
Εκείνη την ημέρα, στις 15 Ιουλίου, ήμουνα στο γραφείο μου 8 παρατέταρτο. Οι πρώτοι επισκέπτες μου θα ήταν μια ομάδα παιδιών από το Κάιρο, που ήρθαν στην Κύπρο ως φιλοξενούμενοι μου. Γύρω στις 8 και 20 περίπου με ειδοποίησαν ότι τα παιδιά είναι στο σαλόνι. Ο επικεφαλής της ομάδος άρχισε να με προσφωνεί από χειρογράφου. Είπε μερικά λόγια και άρχισαν οι πυροβολισμοί. Οπότε έφτασε κάποιος από την προεδρική φρουρά για να μου πει ότι τεθωρακισμένα και τάγκς ήσαν μπροστά στην είσοδο και άρχισε η επίθεση κατά του προεδρικού μεγάρου. Μερικοί φίλοι εκεί με συνεβούλευσαν να εγκαταλείψω την Κύπρο. Δεν είχα όμως μέχρι τη στιγμή εκείνη σκεφτεί ένα τέτοιο πράγμα και η πρώτη μου αντίδραση ήταν αρνητική. Δεν ήθελα να φύγω από την Κύπρο και να νομίσει ο λαός ότι τον εγκατέλειψα και έφυγα για να σώσω τη ζωή μου. Τελικά όμως, και αφού ακούστησαν πολλά επιχειρήματα, επίστηκα πως ήταν το καλύτερο να φύγω από την Κύπρο, ώστε εκτός Κύπρου ελεύθερος να μπορώ να εργαστώ εναντίον των πραξικοπηματιών.
As the United States stood by, the junta quickly replaced President Makarios with Nikos Samson, known primarily as a right-wing extremist who had allegedly killed 12 people during ethnic clashes in Nicosia. Samson believed he had restored peace and order to Cyprus. But the real storm had yet to strike.
I think the idea of some of the colonels anyway in Athens was to incorporate Cyprus into Greece. This, needless to say, had exercised the Turkish population and Turkey itself. And so that led to a lot of tension.
Five days later, on July 20th, Turkey invaded Cyprus.
Και αφού πέρασαν οι πρώτες μέρες του πραξικοπήματος και νομίζαμε ότι ανασάναμε λιγάκι, άρχισε η τουρκική εισβολή και τότε είδαμε το νοσοκομείο να γεμίζει αμέσως από τραυματίες. Ερχόντουσαν οι τραυματίες από όλους τους δρόμους και με όλα τα μέσα. Είδαμε καμένους με βόμβες ναπάλ, με ρουκέτες. Το νοσοκομείο γέμισαν οι διαδρόμοι. Βάλαμε παντού. Επιτάξαμε τις κλινικές της Λευκωσίας και πάλι δεν υπήρχε χώρος για τους τραυματίες. Ήταν κάτι που πραγματικά δεν μπορώ να περιγράψω, δεν μπορώ να φανταστεί κανένας το τι είδαμε και τι...
I think the U.S., if it had moved, could have prevented the coup by Samson, which the junta in Athens was behind. And had they prevented that coup, Makarios would have continued as the president. And I think it would be much more problematic that Turkey would have found the pretext.
The Turkish pretext was to protect the independence of Cyprus. The London-Zurich Agreement allowed Turkey, Greece, or Great Britain to take action against any threat to this independence. The Turkish invasion clearly went much further. Titina Loizithu was living in the port city of Kyrenia when Turkish forces landed on the beachhead in 1974.
I grew up in Kyrenia. My father comes from Kyrenia, and I grew up in Kyrenia, which is on the northern part of Cyprus, in a lovely setting between the sea and the mountains.
Using arms supplied by the U.S., Turkish forces managed to overcome the stiff resistance of the tiny Cypriot National Guard in and around Kyrenia, and occupied a narrow corridor linking Kyrenia to the Turkish Cypriot enclave in Nicosia. Terrified Greek Cypriots fled south.
They drove the Greek Cypriot population from the north to the south systematically, sometimes through terror, sometimes just through pushing, sometimes through putting them on buses and driving them across to the line.
Greek Cypriots were feeling that they were being pushed out of their land in the north, which they were, because the Turks had gotten quite spirited in protecting their territory, even though the Greeks owned a good bit of it.
When I got married, I could not settle in Kyrenia, where we could have had our home built. So we settled in Nicosia in anticipation to go back to Kyrenia when the political situation would have allowed us to go back and forth to Kyrenia in a short time.
Within 3 days of the Turkish invasion, both the Greek junta in Athens and its puppet regime in Cyprus collapsed. The successor to President Makarios, Glafkos Kleridis, took office.
So, of course, when in 1974 this dictatorship collapsed, I was delighted, as all my Greek friends were. But I realized that a terrible price had been paid for this emancipation, this liberation of Greece, and the price had been paid by Cyprus. That it was only because of the mad adventure of the colonels in their attempt to overthrow Archbishop Makarios that Greece was once again free. That seemed a very high price to pay.
A ceasefire mandated by the UN Security Council was arranged. From July 25th to July 31st, the UK, Greece, and Turkey met in Geneva to discuss the invasion amidst strong fears that Turkey would launch a second, more powerful offensive. Critics say the United States did little to restrain Turkey.
We needed to send a strong signal to Turkey that they couldn't just move without there being some consequences that would be associated with that as a check or an inhibition on Turkish action, because they struck in there and they moved troops in, and of course then they paused.
British Foreign Secretary James Callaghan led the Geneva peace talks, attended by U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Arthur Hartman.
It was quite clear from those meetings that there was sort of no understanding. And Callaghan talked to me about, can you Americans stop this second invasion, which it looks like it's about to take place.
On August 14th, they resumed their offensive, and that's, of course, when they occupied over a third of the island, and when you had 200,000 refugees as a consequence. That was a disaster. I mean, they were in Geneva, engaged in talks under Callaghan's chairmanship, the Greeks and the Turks, and then the Turks launched this attack early in the morning. They were in late the night before, trying to work out, a peaceful resolution of the matter.
There's an eerie silence about the once thriving town. Certainly the Greek Cypriots, who make up 4/5 of its population, appear to have given up hope of keeping it out of Turkish hands. At first light, the Turkish jets bombed it, adding to the damage caused by similar attacks 3 weeks ago. They hit empty office blocks and deserted apartments. Whatever the Greek resistance may be in the face of the advancing Turks to the northwest of the city, there's none apparent in Famagusta itself.
The second offensive was as brutal as feared. Turkey occupied the northern one-third of Cyprus. Hundreds of young Greek Cypriot men were rounded up and never heard from again.
It was a situation of immense gloom and tragedy. If you use the term Greek tragedy, it fitted absolutely to think that half the population of the island were pushed out of their houses, out of their homes. They became refugees, and they crossed from the Turkish-occupied north to what became the Greek Cypriot controlled south. Many of them, it was summertime at the time, some of them came over with their swimming trunks and nothing else.
Εμείς αγράμματοι τι ξέρουμε να μιλήσουμε, να πούμε εμείς αγράμματοι. Εμείς θέλουμε 10 μέρες και καρκιά μας την καρμία να πάμε στο χορκό μας. Πάμε, έσχομαι και πέφτουμε μέσα στην αυλή μας. Έτσι πέφτουμε μέσα στην αυλή. Πέθανε η μάμα μας. Η μάμα μου πέθανε.
Και πώς ήρθες εδώ πέρα?
Μόνη ήρθα. Με λεωφορείο χωριανών ήρθα. Ο αδερφός μου είναι εχμάλωτος. Ο αδερφότεγνος μου είναι εχμάλωτος στην Τουρκία.
As the Cyprus crisis unfolded in that summer of 1974, another crisis was reaching its climax in Washington. Watergate.
There was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
The executive branch was completely caught up in the Nixon departure from the presidency. I actually was on the House Judiciary Committee, which voted the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon.
Nixon was just about to go down the tube at that point. And it was quite clear to me from afar that there was no way of getting the American government's attention for something as serious as intervening in Cyprus to stop a second invasion.
Hartman, representing America's interests at the Geneva peace talks, says he could barely get the ear of his boss, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. In retrospect, he thinks he understands why.
Looking back at some of the memoirs, he was on his knees with Nixon in the Oval Office at virtually the time I was in Cyprus. So he did not have much of his attention focused on what the hell I was doing out there.
But in Washington, State Department officials did hear from Kissinger.
Dr. Kissinger removed me from my position as the head of the Cyprus operation shortly after the invasion. So I cannot speak to that from firsthand experience. But I recommended that to Dr. Kissinger that he use his considerable influence to keep the Turkish army in the enclave where they were originally before they drove to both coasts. And we obviously did not bring enough pressure to achieve that, because they did break out of the Kyrenia pocket and their tanks went to both coasts, thus dividing the island in half.
Some analysts of the era conclude that Kissinger refrained from restraining Turkey's second offensive because he preferred partition as the ultimate solution.
It's difficult to encapsulate the wickedness of Kissinger's role in a sentence, but if you wanted to try for an epigram, it would be to support the Greeks as long as they were fascists, to turn against them only when they were democrats, to support the Turks only when they were aggressors, and to end up with a country ruined and partitioned, which I have to believe was in fact the objective of the policy in the first place.
My suspicion is that given Kissinger's orientation, his practice of realpolitik, his belief that Turkey was a vital regional power and an important ally in NATO, led him to sacrifice Cyprus to Turkey, that it was important to keep Turkey happy, not alienate the Turkish military especially, and that therefore this was an occasion where the United States just needed to look the other way with regard to this act of aggression.
Of course, Kissinger had he comes with a very sort of geostrategic view of how the world works. And in that view, Turkey always loomed important to him, as it has tended to do in the minds of our military and intelligence people over the years. So I think he was reluctant, I think, to move as firmly and resolutely against Turkey to check them from taking these actions. As a consequence, we were then confronted with this incredible, difficult situation, which we have not been able to undo and resolve even to this day.
Kissinger, in his memoirs, denies encouraging the second offensive, but says he was distracted by the political crisis at home. Neither Callahan nor I had expected the second Turkish military move, and during the crucial 4 days of the political negotiations, my days, and to an even greater degree, my emotions, were focused on easing Nixon's travail and preparing for the transition to Ford. However, a recently declassified memorandum quotes Henry Kissinger saying that he not only expected the second Turkish invasion, but actually endorsed it. Some of my colleagues want to cut off assistance to Turkey. That would be a disaster. There is no American reason why the Turks should not have 1/3 of Cyprus. Kissinger's failure to exercise any meaningful effort to restrain the Turkish invasion was not lost on the Greek Cypriot population, who expressed their fury in a mock funeral of the U.S. Secretary of State. Greek Cypriot officials of the time were also angered, adamant in their belief that the U.S. could have saved them from Turkish occupation.
Ότι αν ο Αμερικανικός παράγων ίσκει όλη την επιρροή του, θα περιορίζεται η τουρκική εισβολή και δεν θα έπαιρνε την έκταση που πήρε αργότερα. Δηλαδή, δεν θα είχαν σήμερα 40% του κυπριακού εδάφους υπό τουρκικών ζυγών.
Another recently declassified State Department memorandum lends credence to the theory that Kissinger was deliberately passive. Helmut Sonnenfeld, a senior counselor to Kissinger, advised his boss to remain silent until the fighting in Cyprus had stopped. He advised that the U.S. should privately assure Turkey that we would get them a solution involving 1/3 of the island with some kind of federal arrangement. A map which projected Turkish military moves and dated 1 day before the second Turkish invasion was available to Kissinger from the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Back in the United States, a storm was brewing over the Nixon and Ford administration's involvement, or lack of it, in the Cyprus crisis. The Los Angeles Times charged that Kissinger knew in advance of the Turkish plan to invade Cyprus in July and had rejected an appeal from U.S. Ambassador to Greece Henry Tosca to use the U.S. Sixth Fleet to stop the invasion. The New York Times accused the State Department of clearly stalling and bluntly charged that the American unwillingness to condemn the Greek junta's coup had encouraged Turkey to intervene on the island. The editorial also declared that cutting off aid to Turkey was mandatory under the law due to Turkey's use of U.S. arms and equipment for offensive purposes. In Congress, members heard from angry constituents outraged by Turkey's aggressive use of American weapons against Cyprus. A movement quickly grew to cut off any further military aid to Turkey as required by U.S. law.
I think at the heart of the matter was the failure of the executive branch of the President and the Secretary of State to enforce the law, because American law provided that arms that were made available to another country be used solely for defensive purposes.
We undertook an effort in the Congress and across the country to marshal sentiment. At the time, we concluded that the one thing that we might do that would really send a very strong and sharp signal was a cutoff of military assistance to Turkey. Our argument was essentially that the law at the time required that. The administration didn't accept that.
The Ford administration bitterly opposed the arms embargo. Secretary of State Kissinger said that it would deprive the U.S. of diplomatic flexibility. Kissinger later wrote in his memoirs that he stressed with futility that the proposed aid cutoff would hurt the Greek cause because it would delay, if not prevent, Turkish concessions while the situation was still fluid. But in late 1974, Congress passed legislation cutting off aid to the Turkish military, including equipment for which Turkey had already paid. President Ford reluctantly signed the measure, known as the Rule of Law Arms Embargo. Its sponsors considered the embargo a major moral victory for American foreign policy.
The morality and the justice of this cause are so clear that what's really at stake are very basic principles with respect to the American foreign policy. And I always said to groups, because, you know, we would get this charge about, quote, the Greek lobby, unquote. This was really an American lobby for American principles and American values that many in this country regard as fundamental to how we conduct our foreign policy.
Unfortunately, Washington's actions did little to improve the situation on the ground in Cyprus. An estimated 170,000 Greek Cypriots were forced from their homes and businesses in the north. Turkey began a rapid resettlement, reportedly bringing over 1,500 settlers a week from Turkey in violation of the Geneva Convention.
You find Turkish settlers from the deep Anatolian plateau who don't dress in modern clothes, whose whole viewpoint is rather on the medieval side. And those people, some of them are from minority groups inside Turkey, and Turkey has put pressure on them to get out, to go someplace else.
They're changing the culture of the North, and if you get Turkish Cypriots to speak honestly to you, they worry about being absorbed into Turkish politics, and the North really is controlled by the Turkish army.
Greek Cypriot homes and property were taken and handed over to the settlers and Turkish Cypriots. To date, more than 160,000 Turks have been settled in northern Cyprus.
Θέλουμε να πάμε σπίτι μας, βαρεθήκαμε. Θέλουμε να πάμε νέσσωμα.
A year after the Turks invaded, a group of displaced women formed a protest march called Women Walk Home for a United Cyprus. Titina Loizidou joined this march.
A group of women decided to demonstrate the fact that women could not go back to their homes. So we mobilized about 30,000 women who, in a very peaceful way, started marching towards Famagusta. The idea was to go into the occupied part, to walk home to Famagusta, which is a city under Turkish occupation since 1974. It's a city which was abandoned, its inhabitants fled as the Turkish troops were entering, and it's a city which is a ghost town, and by walking there we wanted to say we come home. So the United Nations, who are in Cyprus peacekeeping force, they are in between the Turkish invading troops and the free area of the Republic, stopped us and we could not go further.
A solution to the Cyprus problem has remained elusive. The apparent indifference of the United States to the illegal Turkish occupation has remained constant, with the exception of the rule of law arms embargo imposed by Congress. But soon after the election of Jimmy Carter, even that was short-lived.
President Carter asked us to lift the arms embargo on Turkey. I think he must have been under pressure from some of the people in the Department of Defense or elsewhere. And as there had been no advance whatsoever on removing Turkish troops from Cyprus, or Turkish settlers from Cyprus.
I think once he got in there, there was a lot of pressure that came to bear from the security establishment within the government, the Pentagon, the intelligence community, and so forth. We had these listening facilities in Turkey that were directed towards the Soviet Union. That security establishment has always given a high geostrategic value to Turkey, and given its location and so forth.
Despite a campaign pledge to find a Cyprus solution based on the rule of law, once in office, Jimmy Carter called the repeal of the embargo his highest foreign policy priority. After close votes in the House and Senate, the embargo was indeed lifted in the fall of 1978. This despite the fact that Turkey still occupied nearly 40% of Cyprus. Turkey's access to U.S. arms was fully restored. In 1983, with its military still occupying the northern third of the island, Turkey created the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. The UN Security Council, European Union, and United States Congress all immediately condemned the action. The Turkish Northern Republic is recognized only by Turkey. The rest of the world recognizes the sovereignty of the Republic of Cyprus over the entire island. Since the 1980s, while on the campaign trail, one presidential candidate after another expressed the urgency of solving the Cyprus issue. But once elected to office, the president relegates the issue to mid-level bureaucrats, where it languishes. Nevertheless, people affected by the issue continued to make their voices heard.
In the last march of March 89, actually it was called the Journey to Freedom. I was seized by the Turkish troops and then detained for 10 hours, along with other women. Being unarmed, obviously, we were no threat. It was very ironic that within our country, we were seized for violating or trespassing the so-called Turkish Northern Republic of Cyprus, which is controlled by the Turkish troops.
Most officials in Washington simply wish the Cyprus problem would go not only on the back burner but off the stove entirely. They don't want to deal with the problem. It brings up a lot of unpleasant issues. It creates tensions in the relationship between Washington and Ankara.
A major legal victory occurred in the mid-1990s when the European Court of Human Rights of the Council of Europe rendered judgments in favor of displaced Greek Cypriots.
A few weeks after, I found out that Turkey had signed Article 25, which allowed individuals to file applications for deprivation of human rights. And I felt that this was a good opportunity for me to express my wish that I would be restored, my human right to be in Kyrenia, where I come from. I found out that I felt that the property I had in Kyrenia reflected my life in Kyrenia. It reflected my family life, not only my family life, but the quality of being in the place where I grew up and I wanted to be.
The court ruled that Turkey has illegally excluded the rightful owners from their property in Turkish-occupied Cyprus. Because it is a member of the Council of Europe, Turkey is bound by the court's decision.
The decision of the court was that Turkey is responsible for whatever is happening in the northern part of Cyprus, because Turkey exercises full control with the presence of 40,000 troops.
The court awarded to Tina Loizidou over $1 million in compensation for the loss of the use of her property in Kyrenia.
I felt very pleased. I felt pleased that this case did not only reflect justice, but also I was pleased that Cypriots could see the future bringing justice to Cyprus. I felt that I was very pleased that a system allowed me to come as far as having a judgment.
Titina's case has paved the way for similar judgments in other property disputes.
They want to go back to their homes. Many of them would actually go back to a small piece of land as long as they had sort of a piratia where they could live.
People have lost their homes. People have had their assets taken away from them. People have had to live not knowing whether they'd ever be able to return home. And I know that a lot of people here in the United States feel that pain. I feel it in my Cypriot American friends.
In 2002, with active U.S. and British participation, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan brought together representatives from both Cypriot communities to negotiate a plan for peace. 2 years of negotiation and 5 drafts later, the Annan plan was put to a nationwide vote. The Turkish Cypriots approved the Annan plan, while the Greek Cypriots rejected it. Significantly, the Annan plan was voted down by a 2/3 majority of all Cypriots.
The Greek Cypriots weren't offered anything by the Annan plan. They were being asked to risk everything, in a sense, for a perhaps, a maybe, and a part of a perhaps and a maybe. The Turkish Cypriots were offered the world, basically. The Greek Cypriots were offered not much at all.
Well, the Annan plan looked very much like a cobbled together device to try to give the illusion that the Cyprus problem was being solved without the problem actually being solved. The Greek Cypriots, for the most part, were asked to make major concessions up front and in terms of very real substance in exchange for largely theoretical possible future concessions on the part of the Turkish Cypriot side and, more importantly, on the part of the Turkish government.
The problem is not the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. The problem is Turkey, actually. If the Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots had been allowed to negotiate a deal between them, I think they would have resolved the problem by now. The former president of the Turkish administration in the north, Rauf Denktaş, was more interested in being a Turkish politician than a Turkish Cypriot politician. So he played the game by getting Turkey on his side, and he also tried to prolong the stay of the Turkish army in Cyprus, which the Turkish army wanted to happen. I mean, the Turkish army likes occupying Cyprus.
We are not saying that Turkish military will stay here in the island, but we are saying that with a solution they will go.
Turkish troops were going to remain in Cyprus indefinitely. There was no provision for having those troops or even a major portion of that occupation force to withdraw as part of the settlement. And it was hardly surprising that Greek Cypriot voters rejected that settlement.
In 2004, the Republic of Cyprus became a full member of the European Union. This has created a real possibility of a settlement for one simple reason. Turkey aspires to join the EU as well, and each EU member must consent to the membership of Turkey.
Probably the most significant leverage there is on Turkish behavior is their desire to enter the EU, and therefore the EU is in a position, as some significant forces in the EU have asserted, that Turkey has to do a number of things to warrant EU membership, and one of them is to peacefully resolve the situation in Cyprus.
The Cypriot strategy of getting into the European Union was nothing short of brilliant. Not only did they highlight the importance of Cyprus as a vibrant economic player, that this would be a useful addition to the European Union, they made a compelling moral case that they would be able to meet all of the criteria set out by the European Union for membership and would be able to do so within a relatively short period of time, and that they should not be punished simply because Turkey had committed an act of aggression and continued to occupy 37% of Cypriot territory.
I think it obviously, in my view, absurd on the face of it that a European Union member should militarily occupy another member of the European Union, and second, refuse to accord it diplomatic recognition.
With the prospect of entry into the EU, Turkey stands at one of the most significant crossroads in its history.
Turkey is going to be disappointed ultimately if it believes it can get into the European Union on its own terms, and especially if it assumes that it can get in while it continues to occupy Cyprus. That is just not going to happen.
Turkey is faced now more and more with a very sharp choice to make. It can modernize itself, it can Europeanize itself, it can democratize itself, and it can retain its secular character, or it can fall back into some version of Ottomanism or theocracy. And rejoin the ranks of the backward nations.
Although the land is divided and the future uncertain, the government-controlled portion of the Republic of Cyprus thrives as a center of tourism, commerce, and international banking. After more than 3 decades of turmoil, the elements of a solution are in place. The question then becomes whether there is a constructive role for a future U.S. administration.
The problem now is who is going to play the role of a third-party mediator, with the UN having tried and failed, if the United States does not play that role. I suppose, in a sense, the Europeans will be working on that issue, but I think it would make a much stronger situation internationally if we were to work with the Europeans and come up with some kind of a structure and try to sell it to both sides.
If there is not much influence exerted on Ankara, on the military, I don't see any change happening. So we do rely on the United States, because the United States is the only country that can exercise their influence on Turkey, to exercise a leverage on Turkey.
My approach would be to be very candid with the Turkish government, that this is an obstacle to continued close cooperation between the United States and Turkey, that if Turkey expects the United States to really weigh in with its friends in the European Union, to treat Turkey's candidacy for admission very seriously, then the Cyprus issue has to be solved, and solved equitably. That we simply will not try to muscle the European Union on Turkey's membership while Turkey continues to occupy a significant part of the territory of its neighbors. Be very candid about that, that the days of Henry Kissinger's willingness to look the other way are over.
Although the U.S. has allowed its credibility as an honest broker in the Cyprus issue to erode, it may still perform a constructive role by affirming its commitment to the rule of law.
I think we have seen almost 2 generations of American policymakers now, that if it is a choice between standing up for moral principles, standing up for the rights of the Cypriot population, or placating Ankara, the United States will opt to placate Ankara every single time.
When it lifted the arms embargo on Turkey in 1978, Congress enacted legislation which remains law to this day. It sets forth principles guiding U.S. policy in Cyprus for a just settlement. These principles include establishing a free and independent government, guaranteeing the protection of human rights, and the withdrawal of Turkish military forces from Cyprus. During the Cold War, President Eisenhower stated that there can be no peace without law, and there can be no law if we were to invoke one code of international conduct for those who oppose us and another for our friends.
The interests, the self-interest of the United States, if you want to call it that, I don't mind. The realpolitik, if you prefer. All of this, plus the importance of Cyprus to the integrity of the principles of the European Union, which is also surely in the national interest of the United States. All of these press in one direction: the withdrawal of the occupiers, the right of Cypriots to self-determination.
Well, Cyprus is important to the United States because it's a friendly country, and it's so much tied up in the politics of the last 3 decades. It's really extraordinary that there hasn't been a solution to the Cyprus problem now in 40, 45 years. And it's important to us because we want to try to achieve a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace, stable and united. And that won't happen until the dividing lines have been erased in Cyprus, until justice has been done, until the conflict has been resolved.
By abandoning the rule of law and its principles, the U.S. had a role in causing the present division of Cyprus. It remains to be seen whether the U.S. can perform a role in reunifying Cyprus.
The status quo is not an option for us because it is not for our benefit. Not ultimately,
Well, I consider Cyprus as a whole, and this is how I lived before in Kyrenia, which was a mixed town, and I don't believe that being separated can bring peace.